Hello and welcome to another lecture on today's topic being strategic development and managing strategic change. So if you think about it, every organization, every individual, so to speak, goes through change. We naturally adapt to our environment. Our environment is constantly changing around us, sometimes more static and sometimes in a more dynamic way. So you've got lots of fast changing movements over here, and we all need to understand how do we cope with that change, or how do we prepare for those kind of changes. So this is very, very essential. If you think you can apply it to your business environment, you can employ it in your personal life as well, right? So let's think about what strategy is. Now, if you think about how strategies are set, right, the process of coming up with a strategy usually involves strategic analysis. So strategic analysis is where you try to consider your current position. You kind of try to analyze your strategic position. Now, what do we mean by strategic position? So strategic position usually considers the internal factors of the business. You try to have an internal view. You try to also have your external view, and you also try to consider your stakeholders. So let's try to think about all three of those things, right? So let's start off with, what do I have currently? So when you're providing an internal analysis, you consider this sort of the 9M models, or you consider a resource audit. So you try to think about what are the sort of knowledge. You think about the human capital. If you think about the tangible, like machinery equipment that we have, the intangible sort of abilities we have, the skills that we have, the competencies we have within our organization. So you try to come up with those kind of internal analysis, and you try to understand, okay, as a business, what are the sort of resources that I have? And because once you understand the resources you have, you'll be able to understand what are my potential limitations and what are the things that I can't achieve, right? So once you think about internally, you also think about the external environment. Now, external environment, you think about macro environment, you think about the things that are going on around us that we have no ability to control, so to speak, right? So there are certain things that you can control, and there are certain things that you can't control. So if you think about it, political movement, okay, if you want to lobby to some extent, maybe you can control that, but the trends, customer trends, and the way their patterns are very hard to actually predict, and it's very hard to actually manage and influence, so to speak. It can be predicted maybe, but it's very hard to influence. That's the correct terminology. You can think about your pestle, you can think about your Porter's five forces, and you can't come about your external analysis. So once you've done your internal analysis and once you've done your external analysis, you also need to consider the stakeholders around you. So whenever you come with stakeholders, the key one is the Mendelow's matrix. The Mendelow's matrix allows you to analyze who are your key players and who are the people that you need to give less attention towards, right? So once you've considered all those things, you can come about with, now you have a good idea of, okay, I'm here right now operating in this industry. There are certain kind of pressure that I have to deal with. There are certain kind of pressure that I have to avoid. And there are certain kind of expectations that my stakeholders have. Therefore, I have choices. Now, if you want to generate choices, you can think about the Bowman's clock, you can think about the Ansoff matrix, you can think about the Toews matrix, and you can generate a sort of which market do I want to operate, or how do I want to go about in order to come about with the next strategy. Do I want to operate in the current setting that I have? Do I want to develop the current market that I want to have? Or do I want to expand into other new markets? Or do I want to expand by having in the existing market by using new products? So these are the kind of different combinations that you want to have. If you think about the Bowman's clock, it gives you an option of thinking about what are the sort of values that what kind of value products that I want to offer, and what kind of target customer customers that I want to offer. So if you think about a no-frill strategy, you think about you providing basic products at low prices, right? If you think about hybrid strategy, you think about providing a more than you think about having average prices and delivering value goods to your products, value goods to your customers, right? This is all about how you perceive in running your business. So what kind of values you want to deliver to your customers and how much do you want to charge them for it? So once you come about with your choice, you think about implementation. Now, implementation has project management, right? So you have your strategy, you break it down into different projects. And once you do assign the project, you have to consider that how are my employees, how are my customers, how is everyone going to react to the decision that I've taken? If you plan for it, there is a higher chance for you to succeed. Now, do you have time for planning? Sometimes you don't. You might have turnaround strategies where your company might be in financial distress, so you need to come about with a quick solution and you don't have time for planning. But, if you don't have time for those things, it's very important that you have an experienced individual undertaking that change, right? So when you have if you think about it, structured means of dealing with complex issues, used as a means of controls, useful means of coordination. So the bottom 2 points over here are just talking about how strategy, the main process is, okay, you select a strategy, you implement it, and then you review it and try to learn from your mistakes or try to learn from what went wrong, and you try to learn as an organization, right? You put that into your organizational database, and the entity, if you think about companies, the company will continue, right? Management might change, but you could archive this into your database, and you could definitely help educate your future managers or your future leaders or owners, so to speak. So once you have a set way of doing things, it does help give you a stability, but you have to understand that if you have a set way of routine works and processes in the way you want to do cultural a set culture within your organization, a set work pattern, set routines and processes, it does help you if you have policies in place, it does help you come about with solutions. However, generally speaking, sometimes you may need to think out of the box, especially in a dynamic environment with the business model changing very quickly. Right. So let's think about what Henry Mintzberg has talked about in terms of emergence, in terms of strategies. So he thinks that Henry Mintzberg believes that strategy can either be deliberate or emergent. So deliberate would be where you select that, okay, I want to operate in China. I want to expand my business into a foreign market. So that's a deliberate strategy. Now, sometimes you can have emergent strategy is where, so emergent strategy is a set of action that is consistent over time, has not been stated in formal plan. So there is a chain shop in USA where they actually opened it as an antique furniture shop, and they used to provide these sample sandwiches to their customers. So what happened was, when they were providing these sandwiches to their customers, eventually they noticed that customers would just walk into their shop just to purchase those sandwiches. So this became what they did was, in the future they opened other kind of branches where they focused on more providing the sort of sandwiches rather than selling the antique furniture. So this is an example of how emergent strategy could come. So once you implemented it, you try to understand that, okay, I've thought about my business working in a certain way, but the way my customers are reacting they like certain aspects more and they dislike the other aspects. So I'm going to focus on the aspects that they like, and I'm going to focus on the aspects that we have more competence in, right? That we didn't realize it when we were coming up with it. Because most of the times when you're planning and when you're executing, there is a huge difference in how your customers perceive in the way you're delivering value to them. So usually happens when strategy collides over time as ideas collide with and accommodate a changing reality. Yeah, so this is it. So you have your ideas and you have your reality, and your environment is constantly changing. Therefore, your ideas what turned out to be like what you do in paper and what's when you execute it, it could be very different. So as an organization, you need to be prepared for those things you plan. You also are accepted, you have to be open to accepting the potential outcomes that you did not formulate when you were deliberating strategy. So it will also be one that arises from external stimulus, not envisaged in the planning strategy. So yeah, this is definitely there when you have a lot of times you'll have a certain movement that comes about, right? And these are certain, like if you think about how the youth movement is when it comes to in the USA, their involvement in political movements nowadays, and the things that they care about. You've got like the Black Lives Matter movement. You've got the movement with regards to the guns policy. So these are things, the volume and the way these movements come about cannot be predicted, but you as a business need to learn and adapt. So Mintzberg believes that strategies are a mixture of both a deliberate and emergent, both deliberate and emergent in nature. He also believes in strategic. He also has classified strategic innovation as the creation of growth strategies that leads to significant new value being generated for the organization. Right. So innovation. If you want to innovate as a business organization, you need to understand that you have to create a culture within that organization that fosters it. Right. So if you want to, if you're operating in an industry that needs to innovate to survive, right? So you think about it, a business can only survive when it provides value to its customers. And the value needs to be provided to the customers in a different way compared to how their competitors are providing it. Otherwise, there would be no distinction between you and your customers, your competitors. And eventually your competitors will think of a way to better provide that value to how you are doing it. So this remaining stagnant and believing in the current work process able to deliver in the long term is not a way to succeed. So deliberate strategies focuses on control. Emergent strategies emphasizing learning through areas such as process redesign and e-business. So these are some big words, right? So if you think about it, process redesign is something that we can cover through the Harman's process strategy matrix, where we learn about what kind of processes that we focus on improving, the ones that are core to our that are strategically important and technical in nature. And you think about business process redesign, where you try to automate all the sort of like non-value added functions, and you try to cut the sort of steps in between. E-business is other ways where you try to e-business is a completely different method of procuring your supplies, delivering your goods to your customers. There's so many different ways you can use e-business over here. So strategic change can be classified by the extent of change and the speed with which it's to be achieved. So these are the two things that you need to consider. You need to consider with whether my business model is changing or not, and how quickly is it changing, right? So if you think about transformation, so transformation thinks about this entails changing an organization's culture. It is fundamental change that cannot be handled within the existing organizational paradigm, right? So what do we mean by existing organizational paradigm? It means that the culture, the routines, and the work processes that we have currently will not work in the sort of long term that we have, right? So this means that if we're living in if we have if our business model is changing, then we cannot use the same work methods, right? If we want to deliver value to our customers, if we have a new segment of customers, we cannot use our older methods to deliver value to them. Okay, so and the other one is where you think about realignment, where you believe that, yeah, we need to adapt, but we can do so by holding on to our way of working. So we can have the way, like our existing management system. We can have the way we the sort of maybe you have a set way of coming about with strategy and coming about with decision making, and you can still continue that. So incremental change is where you believe that change is over a longer period of time. And Big Bang is where change is uh, very much upon you, right? So it's right now. It's a crisis situation. You need to have that change within the current year or less time when you think about it. So Big Bang usually happens when you have external stimulus in the form of poor financial results. So poor financial results usually lead to turnaround strategies, which would mean that you need to save your company or save your organization from the sort of downward spiral that is going on. If you think about technological industries, and certain industries always have because it's very dynamic in nature, you would always need to consider that change would have to be in a big bang, so in a way that is very quick, right? Constant. So once you classify, once you consider the sort of nature of change and the sort of the scope of it, you try to understand, you try to classify them into four different things. So first of all, you have adaptation. Adaptation is where you have incremental change, and when you believe that you can do those changes within the existing organizational paradigm. So here we've broken down organization paradigm into culture, processes, and competencies. I'd really like for you to focus on these three words, because these three words are very key in trying to define what a paradigm is. So when you say that, okay, there are two different ways of working. One way is where you maintain your existing paradigm, and the other way is when you have to change your paradigm in order to adapt to your new strategies, right? So when you think about reconstruction, so reconstruction is where you have your existing organizational paradigm, but the change has to happen in a more it's very much quick, right? So this is where you think about crisis situation over here. So much quicker change brought about by external pressures such as a new competitor, innovation, or change in the regulatory environment. So you would need to definitely respond to these kind of external factors, but you believe that you can maintain your existing way of working, so to speak. So evolution is where you believe that, in the long term, you need to change the way your business model works over here. So this is incremental in nature, but you do believe that the scope of your business has to change with time, right? And this is where Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington suggest as the most difficult thing, because organizations, if they want to shift, in the 10 or 15 years time, if they believe that their industry is dying in their maturity to decline stage and they have to shift to a different industry or shift to a different market segment, then they would have to gradually have a different you have to change the way your managers approach those situations as well. This is usually done through recruitment. So when you think about revolution, so revolution is where you believe that your business model is changing, and you believe that you would have to respond to that change in the business model in a very short time. So this dynamic environment, along with the business model changing, would require you to have potentially staff that are ready and accepting towards change. So when you try to think about change, you need to think about the contextual features of the Hope Hailey model, the kaleidoscope, and you try to consider 7 factors over here. So you first of all start off with the time factor. So if you have more time, then if you think about if it's an incremental change, then you have more time to plan, and the more time you have for planning, the more chances you have for succeeding. If you think about a shorter time, then it's more riskier, and the likelihood of failure definitely increases. If you think about it, if you have less time, then your stakeholders may also react in a more negative way towards your proposed change. You consider about preservation. So what are the elements in my organization that I want to preserve in this whole change process, right? So what are the things that are working well for us that we need to continue to do so in the future? What are the sort of value adding components that we have within our business model, like business organization, that we want to keep? Usually this would mean if you have skilled staff, if you have skilled employees working in a technical industry, you would try to retain them because they are essential to your success. Diversity is where you try to understand, first of all, you try to consider two things. So you try to consider whether your employees have a conflict of opinions. So if you have different departments having a conflict of opinions, then it usually means that you might have more problems when you're trying to achieve a set change in strategy, right? Because some employees would be more accepting towards change, and there could be other powerful employees that become blockers to your set strategy and causing it to fail. The other thing is that if your company has a set strategy, right? If it has a set strategy for like a number of years, then they don't have a diversity of experience. So if you have many different kind of strategies going on in the past, then you have a diversity of experience, which would help you achieve that change, which would actually essentially help, provide the sort of necessary experience to your employee and your organization. Capability is whether you have the managerial or the sort of staff human resource to carry out the change. You also try to understand whether, so you need to understand whether you have the internal employees. So do you have within the organization, or do you need to get someone more experienced from externally, or because you have internal problems where you might not have in the, you believe that your managers would not be able to view the organization in a different way, you try to get someone in externally because you don't believe the skill sets that are necessary to guide you through that change currently exist, right? The other thing is you try to understand whether you have the sort of resources and skills. So these are two really key things. When you think about resources, you think about tangible resources, you think about so there are basic resources, there are threshold resources, and there are unique resources, right? So basic resources do not give you any sort of competitive advantage, but unique resources do. If you think about, you need to think about the 9M model, where you think about the sort of tangible resources that you have and the intangible resources that you have. So then you think about the sort of like your human capital, you think about the sort of knowledge within your organization, you think about the sort of other factors about, machinery and all those like financial resources that you have. Generally speaking, a lot of the time it's financial resources that you have. Skills is also, do you have the sort of employees, or do you have the competencies? The competencies means the way you deliver value, right? So what are the method for, if you think about how you can take your product or service from the base or the raw from the beginning into your customer's head, right? If you think about the value chain, right? Value chain is more suited to your manufacturing environment. So you have products at the inbound logistics, where you try to get raw materials, and all the way you think about how it's delivered to your customers and the after sale services. So it's very important for you to consider the sort of skills that you have, because if you do not have the right skills for your strategy, you would need to recruit it. The other thing you need to consider is the readiness towards change. So usually when your stakeholders, when your employees have a more diversity experience, they are more ready, they are more prepared to change. If they believe that the power and their interest, the makeup of their group and the interest of themselves are being affected, then employees will be resistant to change. So say, for example, I'm a doctor, right? I'm not really a doctor, but for example, if I was a doctor, and if I was working in a clinic, so I am a professional. So if I'm professional, I want a certain degree of control with the way I want to do my work, right? And if someone kind of tells me, that we need for you to change your way of working because we believe that the organization needs to achieve some sort of financial cost savings, and we need to deliver benefits to our customers. By that time, I've already lost track of what you're saying, because as a professional, I'm not interested in the way administrators are dictating the way they want to achieve change, right? So, especially if I believe that it would increase my work and workload in a way that does not add value to my profession, right? So you have to understand that if your employees are affected by your change in a negative way, they're obviously going to be resistant towards it. This is common for everyone. If I have a set way of working, and if my employers or if someone asks me to do things in a different way that does not benefit me in any way, I would definitely oppose it. So you need to understand that in order to make sure if you want to reduce the resistance, you need to communicate better with your employees, your stakeholders, in order to help them understand the sort of benefits they would achieve and the sort of benefits that the organization would achieve in order to provide them value overall, right? So if you say, for example, if you communicate to your employees that the said benefit would help us with longevity, it would help us with the sort of long-term survival, dealing with competitors, and if we do well, we can provide you some sort of returns as well. So this is a very key in convincing them to hop on board and join your cause. The other thing is you need to consider with the power of stakeholders. Again, this is where you do your Mendelow's matrix and you try to do perform an analysis and you try to understand which department or which staff is a key player in the said change, and how do I bring him on board in order to ensure that there is no sort of blockers and there is no sort of there's no failure in strategy. Because if you have powerful stakeholders opposing your strategy, there is no way for you to achieve that change. So then we go on to one of the models. So we think about Lewin's force field analysis. We try to understand over here that first of all, in the force field analysis, we try to identify factors that promote change. So we say that these facilitate change, and we think about those that hinder change and those that block us. So traditional to represent these forces by arrows that correspond to their perceived strengths. So we start off by defining the problem. We try to listen to the forces supporting and opposing to address them. We draw the force field analysis. We decide on how to strengthen or weaken forces through persuasion, coercion, participation, or bargaining. Okay, so let me just stop there. So if you think about it, when you're trying to achieve change, there are some factors or some parts of the organization that will be more accepting towards it, and there are some parts of it that will be resistant towards it. So it's your job for you to identify the degree of resistance and those that a degree of supporting that cause, right? Because if you have powerful stakeholders providing a substantial amount of opposition towards your set change, then you would need to find a way of weakening it through persuasion and other methods. Because if you think about it, coercion is where you try to forcibly put the change through, and it usually has long-lasting negative effects on the organization and your employees. Because nobody forgets when they're treated, or nobody forgets when they're treated in a way that makes them feel that they've been cheated, or makes them feel that they have been exposed, or if you think about it, just so this, it has to do more with exploited. That's the word that I was looking for. So yeah. It's really important for you to understand that word, exploited. Then we move on to identify the sort of resources that we would need in order to help us go through with the change. We try to make an action plan of how we want to implement the sort of change strategy. We try to put them into sort of like when we define these kind of milestones, we try to also define the sort of responsibilities and the individuals that would need to, if you define the roles and responsibilities, if you define milestones, if you use the SMART objective, and if you define objectives, break it down into small sort of like levels, it definitely makes your strategy much more the likelihood of you achieving that success, it's a lot higher. This is very true in almost any circumstance. So if you think about a huge project that has been handed to you, break it down into smaller goals. This is with anything. If you have to submit a 1,000-page report, break it down into how many do I need to write within a day, then how much do I have, the time frame do I have within a month. Say if I have a month, how much work do I need to do every day, how much work do I need to do every hour. If you plan that out, it becomes much more sensible. Yeah. Okay, if you want management styles to change, JSW identify 5 styles of change management. So if you think about change management, you think about education and communication, you think about collaboration or participation, intervention, direction, and coercion. So this is a continuum, right? So on the extreme one side, you've got where the leaders are thinking about a more participative style, where you try to believe that if you communicate, then you have a much more higher degree of acceptance. Collaboration, participation, education, communication are sort of on the similar nature, where you're having a more democratic approach with achieving the change. This is very important when you have skilled employees, and when you have your employees are very fundamental for your success. And when it comes to skilled employees, you need to make them feel that they're part of the set strategy, or it's very difficult for them to, convince them to be part of what change that you're having. Intervention and like direction and coercion. So this, when you go into intervention, when you think about direction and coercion, so this is when you sort of like move from more paternalistic style into an autocratic style, and the extreme end of it is coercion, where coercion is where you force your employees to do certain things. Now, if you have a lot of power within your organization, if you have a lot of respect, then you can actually coerce your employees. But coercion leads to the feeling of being exploited, which generally does not help in the long term. However, if you're in a crisis situation, you're thinking about how to survive tomorrow, then you're not worried about 10 years down the line, will my employees feel hurt? Right now, you're thinking about tomorrow, I need to be okay, so I'm just going to forcibly instill the change that I want, like within the organization, in order to achieve my objective. Okay, so let's think about education and communication. So when you think about education and communication, it's generally suitable in an incremental environment. So you have a lot of time in your hands. You think about where the management would have to set the tone at the top, where they foster an environment that helps with learning, helps with communicating, where they try to find these different ways in order to encourage their employees with communicating with them and communicating with each other. The problem is that yes, communication and discussion and deliberation is very time consuming. The second method is where you have a collaboration or participation. Again, a discussion or a democratic approach does lead to consumption of time. It also is, you have to consider with the existing culture. So it sounds very good that when you walk into any organization, no one would like to, most organizations would like to call themselves as very employee-friendly organization, someone that helps their employees flourish under them, all these fancy, extravagant words. But the nature of it, or the reality of it, is that a lot of them have leaders that are paternalistic in style, where they would listen to you, but at the end of the day, they will take all the decisions by themselves. All right. So within these kind of organizations, it's very hard for the senior management, and it's very hard for the employees as well, who are very used to being guided, to suddenly start providing their opinions, right? Because if I'm working in an environment where I'm very cautious about the sort of outcomes, so therefore I need to be guided, and suddenly one day my manager comes and tells you that, how about you take this decision for me? Suddenly I'm very wary of the sort of consequences that could come about it, and I am not sure if I'm ready to take on that kind of responsibility. So you can generally feel how these kind of approaches can be not perfect for some organization. And in some industries or some kind of such setting, it's almost impossible. So if you are running a military organization, you don't want to call in all the everyone in the organization and ask them that, do you think it's okay if we have set strategy, if we want to have this kind of like a mission or something like that? That does not work. So intervention is where you have an change agent. So if you have a change agent over here, you can generally have an external agent, or you can external individual that you appoint, or you could have an within the organization, right? So this is appropriate for incremental change, and this helps because where the change agent, so the change agent is the individual who is guiding the process, but he's not going to do everything, right? So he's going to be willing to delegate the roles and responsibilities to the certain individuals as they are like required to. So he's providing an overview. He's experienced. He knows what to do, but he's not doing everything, right? So this is the key thing. If I think about it, every good leader knows how to delegate, because at the end of it, if you do not know how to delegate, your organization cannot expand beyond a certain size. So think about owner-managed businesses, right? Sole traders, or if you think about in terms of the organizational configuration and entrepreneurial structure, where you have an entrepreneur and you have a simple structure with a very like small lines in between. There are not much it's very flat, wide and flat, right? So these organizations, if you have those kind of processes over there, then you need to understand that you need to delegate more if you want to expand beyond certain divisions, if you want to have more branches, so to speak, right? Okay, so when you consider about direction over here, you try to understand that so when you're giving direction, it's more you've moved into the continuum of more autocratic style. So this is where you're telling them that this is the way you want to work, right? And this is where the senior managers use their authority to basically set objectives for or set roles and responsibilities, or set them to do specific tasks, right? So it certainly reduces the degree of autonomy, and it's more rather focusing on you to provide the specific tasks. So this is usually it's usually used in an environment where the consequences of the outcome of the strategy is very important in nature. Therefore, you cannot leave it to chance with your employees, especially when they are unskilled, or they do not have the right sort of skills in order to provide any sort of valuable input into the change strategy. Transformational change, this is useful in an environment where change is in big bang in nature. So and also if you think about because you have your change is coming through, your model is changing very quickly, you need to understand that having someone dictate the way the tasks is important. So it also, when you think about resistance to change, because you're imposing your authority, you usually overcome that barrier, so to speak. Coercion is an extreme form of direction, so it's an extreme form of using your autocratic leadership strategy, and where you forcibly use your employees. So when you have you need to understand that coercion can only be used in times of crisis and when you have the level of power. So if you do not have the power, you cannot force your employees to go through change. So this particular method is effective, but it has its certain elements that would need to be pre-existing conditions that you need to meet in order for you to apply this approach. Right. So if you think about the Hope Hailey model, so we've previously discussed this, adaptation would be where you try to instill a more collaborative or participative approach because you have a lot of time. It's incremental in nature. When you have a revolution, so revolution is when you have changes big bang, so it's very quick, and the scope of change is also like transformational. So you have the model of business model changing. So when you think about business model, you think about the market segment. So if you have the market segment changing or the way you do your business changing, then you consider that to be transformational. So when you have very quick speed of change is really high and the business model is also changing, you need to understand that you have to give in times of crisis, or in times of very quick change. It's better for you to provide strict guidelines in order to avoid confusion, right? So because if in times of crisis, if you're having a discussion between employees, it's just not going to work. You need a figurehead to provide clear direction, and in some extreme cases, coercion also, because you do not have time for employees' resistance, right? You do not have time to deal with that. Evolution is where you believe that, yeah, your business model is changing, but it's more incremental in nature. Therefore, you try to put in a certain degree of participation, where you believe that employees can provide valuable feedback, and employees, in order for you to retain their services, you need to make them feel involved. Otherwise, you're alienating them. But in certain cases, you need to also stamp your authority and provide the sort of direction that they would need. Reconstruction, on the other hand, is where you have an emphasis on. Reconstruction is where you have the emphasis is the transform, like the model, organizational culture, or the organizational paradigm is not changing. So the business model is not changing, so to speak, but you believe that the nature of, like, the time frame is very fast over here, right? So because the time frame is very, like, you don't have time in your hand, so you call, like, in this case, you use direction. So this is used in turnaround strategies, or in times of financial crisis, where you need to achieve better results within a year, within your certain, like, current market segment, or the current way of working that you're doing right now. So other organizational methods that you can adapt towards. Right. So when you're considering about the sort of leadership style that you want to when you want to emphasize or employ in your change program, you need to consider certain factors. So you need to consider about the organizational structure. So if you have a hierarchical organization where it's very much there is a fixed chain of command, there is very much like a set structure in place, then there are certain kind of, like, where the managerial authority exists, then you can definitely use more of a power direction style, especially in terms of crisis. So power structures are where usually there is a centralized management at the top, where they try to take decisions by themselves. The other thing is that managers generally prefer a method of operating. So if you have an authoritarian manager, it's because he either was brought up in an organization that prefers using their authority, or he is, sometimes there is a certain case where there is a lack of confidence that requires him to because he has a lack of confidence, he prefers to use authoritarian methods, where he generally avoids communicating with your staff. So if you have if you have a boss, or if you have a leader that is generally using power or coercion, it could be very well that they're insecure in the way they want to communicate with your employees. Yeah. The other thing is that, okay, you do not have a set way of leadership. So leadership style is situational. So this is like when you use the contingency theory, where you believe that the style would be changing regarding, depending on the sort of objectives that you want to achieve, and it depends on the situation. So if you have certain places where you need to use direction, and there are certain areas of the element of the change program where you believe that you can definitely allow a much more participative style. So when you believe that there are five, if you believe that strategic leadership, you consider five factors. You consider the strategy itself. You consider the sort of human resources that you have, whether they have skills or unskilled. You believe in the sort of expertise. In terms of expertise, you believe in the managerial capabilities. You believe in the employees as well. And you also try to believe, you try to have control, and you try to consider the change itself happening towards at the end. So let's think about the strategy approach. So the strategy approach, the leader approaches a strategy by focusing on strategic analysis and formulation of strategy, and lets other managers deal with operations and management of change. So this is where you have the leaders at the top taking all the decisions with the long term and leaving the operational and tactical decisions with the operational manager, so to speak. The human assets approach believes that this organization is more concerned with recruiting the right people in order to develop the right culture, and therefore you're fostering a sort of a learning environment where you believe that through innovation you would be able to provide better value to your customers. And because you emphasize that innovation within your organization, you believe that recruiting the right people is the best way to go. The expertise approach is where you believe that some sort of technical expertise is required to form a competitive advantage, and therefore, that is the basis of change management over here. So the expertise could be, you remember when we talked about the change agent? So the change agent is where you believe that you need to appoint someone either externally if you believe. And if you think about the contextual features, we talked about how you have certain elements you want to preserve and certain elements, like if you believe that those, also if you think about the capability part, where you believe, do you have the right sort of skills and resources? So this is where you believe that you would need to have the sort of technical skills in order for you to achieve the sort of change that you're looking for. So the control approach is where strategy is seen more of a way of setting defined ways of regulating, like defined ways of measuring the sort of outcome that you're trying to achieve, and routinely trying to assess whether the set strategy is achieving that particular goal, right? So you have there are very different ways. This is like a very contrast between the way the manager or the leader values or approaches change. So this particular leader is more in the cost control if they think about other kind of systems they want to place. The change approach is where the leader focuses on continual change and expends a lot of effort on communication and motivation. So this change approach is where you believe that you're working in a transformational environment where you believe that the business model is constantly changing, and you believe that it's generally big bang in nature. So you have the time frame being very short. So therefore you need to be very open towards change. It's in technical industries. If you have like in the technology, if you have any kind of industries that are using IT services, generally this was very prevalent in those areas. So when it comes to leadership, you can contrast it in two different ways. You can think about it in terms of transactional leaders, where they generally prefer to focus on control systems, or you can think about transformational leaders, where they try to focus on communicating with your employees in order to ensure that they are on board with your strategy and they're more accepting towards change. So this is where you feel like you have very skilled employees that you need to use a participative style, and therefore transformational leadership actually helps achieve change in a dynamic environment as well, because you're constantly reminding them and encouraging them to adapt and learn and innovate to stay competitive with your competitors.